Hello, thank you for tuning in to Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani, to unpack the latest news from Gaza region and across the world. Moin, thank you for joining us again. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me, Nasim. It's always a pleasure.
I want to begin again with the hostage deal and the latest reports that Hamas is suspending the release of any further hostages due to Israeli violations. And then move to this crazy plan of Trump, which has been on the headlines for the past week. The latest on that, the plan being to own Gaza, as he says. And today, I think he announced that if Palestinians were expelled, they would not be allowed to return to Gaza. That's the latest more details he gave this morning. And then we'll speak about further revelations regarding 7 October. Uh, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Galant, the former, sorry, Defense Minister Yoav Galant, he gave an interview last week and revealed that the Israelis actually invoked the Hannibal Doctrine, which is basically to kill their own civilians instead of allowing them to be taken as hostages, and other reports regarding Israel's use of toxic gas in Gaza. So we will discuss some of that as well, and many of the other latest developments from the region. But I want to begin with, as I mentioned, uh, the hostage deal. Hamas announced this morning that it is suspending the release of hostages, which was, I think, planned for Saturday in violation, what Israeli violations. The latest is that, well, we're recording this Monday, 10th of February. So the latest is that Hamas is no longer going to continue with the negotiations. So I want to basically get your thoughts, first of all, on how we've arrived at this first major
Sure.
crisis in the ceasefire agreement. How did we get here, and what is expected now that Hamas is threatening to suspend the release of any further hostages?
Well, there are multiple reasons that explain how we get here, but I think first we need to backtrack and clarify that this is not a hostage deal, or in fact, it's much more than a hostage deal. It's what we're talking about, what Israel and Hamas have agreed is a three-stage deal, which includes in the first phase, a suspension of hostilities, exchange of captives between Israel and Hamas, both prisoners, Israeli prisoners and hostages, and Palestinian prisoners and hostages. Um, it includes freedom of movement within the Gaza Strip. It includes varying degrees of Israeli withdrawal from territory within the Gaza Strip that Israel has occupied. And last but absolutely not least, it also includes an very substantial increase in the provision of urgently needed humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip, not only food, water, medicines, and so on, but also given Israel's systematic destruction of the Gaza Strip, and particularly of the northern Gaza Strip, of housing, tents and other forms of protection against the elements during the middle of the winter. So what has happened is that today, Monday, the 10th of February, Hamas's military spokesman, Abu Ubaidah, made a statement that Hamas is indefinitely suspending the further release of Israeli captives, prisoners, and hostages, because of Israeli violations of the ceasefire agreement of the agreement, and the Israeli violations that he identified in the statement concern multiple issues. Of course, there have been repeated Israeli killings, including by sniper fire, of Palestinians within the Gaza Strip. There have been a restrictions placed on the provision of urgently needed humanitarian aid in the northern Gaza Strip, And this relates also to the mass expulsion plan, which I'll get to in a minute, and basically continuous Israeli foot dragging about implementing its obligations under this agreement. So those are kind of the direct reasons that Israel is not fulfilling its explicit obligations under the agreement, and therefore Hamas is suspending the fulfillment of its own obligations until further notice. The second factor here is the statements and policies adopted by the Israeli government with respect to the future of this agreement. So, what was agreed was that the second stage of this agreement was not specified and not conclusively concluded at the outset. But what the parties agreed was that they would commence with negotiations for the second stage on the 16th day of the first stage. What has happened now is that the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has sent his delegation, negotiating team, to the Qatari capital, Doha, but has not authorized them to begin negotiations about the second phase. And what he is instead seeking to do is to extend the first phase indefinitely so that there would be further Israeli Palestinian exchanges of captives without concluding the second stage, which calls for not just a suspension of hostilities, but a durable cessation of hostilities. And this is something that Netanyahu is desperately seeking to avoid. People have pointed out that one of his key coalition partners, the Jewish Power, or rather religious Zionism movement, has threatened Netanyahu that if he concludes the second stage of the agreement, including a durable ceasefire, that religious Zionism will leave the coalition and the government will fall. This is undoubtedly an important motivation for Netanyahu. But there are also other reasons, and these are not only the let's say the personal motivations Netanyahu has for remaining in office in order to avoid prosecution and prison for his various offenses under Israeli domestic law. It also relates to the broader attitude of Israel that it has not managed to achieve its objectives during its genocidal military campaign in the Gaza Strip, and that it therefore needs to resume the war at some point in order to seek to achieve those objectives at the end of the day. And here I think the exchanges during this past weekend were quite painful for Israel because, on the one hand, Hamas this time released its captives in the central Gaza Strip in Deir al-Balah, where it had not previously conducted any captive release, did so behind a large sign saying, "We are the next day." In other words, if you think there's going to be a day after plan that excludes us, forget about it. And then the following day, Israel was forced to complete its withdrawal from what it calls the Netzarim corridor, the corridor occupied in the Gaza Strip that bisects the territory between the northern part and the central and southern sectors. And Israel had repeatedly stated that it intends to permanently occupy that in order to have what it calls security control over the entire Gaza Strip indefinitely. So that was, in a sense, a major strategic failure, a strategic defeat, even if you will, for Israel, and kind of drove the point home that Israel can't really achieve its objectives unless it resumes its genocidal campaign and hopes that it will succeed where it has failed. So now Israel is putting forth all kinds of new proposals that it will accept potentially negotiating the second stage of the ceasefire if the Hamas leadership voluntarily departs from the Gaza Strip, if Hamas dismantles its military infrastructure, if Hamas does this, that, and the other, all things that are nowhere mentioned in the ceasefire agreement. And as Israel typically does, first you negotiate an agreement. Then you negotiate the implementation of the agreement, and then you have to negotiate all over again because Israel seeks to amend and revise the very terms of the agreement that it has already endorsed. And Hamas is basically saying, we're having none of this until you begin respecting what you've already agreed to, and you begin implementing what you've agreed to as you've agreed to do it. The key achievement in this agreement for you, the release of Israeli captives and hostages, is now indefinitely suspended. And there's a third element here, which we'll get into later, so I'll just mention it very briefly, is that these developments, of course, are taking place within the larger context of the U.S. Initiative announced by President Trump to forcibly expel the entire Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip and to disperse them among various Arab states with no prospect of returning to the Gaza Strip and so on. So this is kind of a warning shot from Hamas that either we implement what was agreed or you suffer the consequences. And I think what Hamas is looking for is seeking to generate significant Israeli public pressure on the government to continue with this agreement, and also making it clear to Washington that your one diplomatic achievement since you assumed office is about to go down the drain if you don't call Israel to order. And if I can just make one last point, I think it's important to understand that Netanyahu can say what he wants and he can do what he wants. And of course, we should understand what he's doing, but ultimately, what he says, what he does, what he wants is really of secondary importance because the key issue here, the key actor here, rather, is the United States. Washington will decide whether or not Israel fulfills its obligations. If the Trump administration instructs Netanyahu to properly implement the first phase of the ceasefire agreement, Netanyahu will do so. If Washington instructs Netanyahu to negotiate and conclude the second phase of the ceasefire agreement, Netanyahu will have no choice but to do so. And if Netanyahu successfully derails the agreement and Israel resumes its genocidal military campaign in the Gaza Strip, that will be because and only because Israel has received a green light from Washington that it does not need to fulfill its obligations and has a free pass to resume its genocide.
It also, I mean, really did strike me as odd, as I'm sure it did with you and many others, that in the middle of a ceasefire agreement, of first phase in the three-phase ceasefire agreement, Trump would come out and make these bold proclamations about his plans for Gaza. Obviously, we would think he would have known that this would torpedo any kind of agreement that you have with Hamas, because you have to see through the negotiations to its end and then maybe make new proclamations. But he did that, I'm sure, knowingly, probably, that he's torpedoing what is already agreed with Israel and Hamas. So it did strike me as being extremely odd. And we will get to that later on. But I want to stick with the release of the hostages for now and focus on the three that were released on Saturday. And of course, it sparked a major row internationally about the conditions of the hostages, looking emaciated, and the health generally. There was a huge contrast between the previous hostages that were released and the three that was released on Saturday. And you published quite a lengthy tweet on the row that sparked as a result. So do you want to just quickly, I think you picked up on all the key major points. And so instead of me going through your quotes, your tweets, and giving my point of view. I think just basically summarize the key
Uh,
argument you make in
uh,
your tweet, which explains all the major talking
sure.
points.
Well, if you remember when we spoke last week, and I believe it was three or four women who were released by Hamas, and on the face of it, they seemed quite healthy. Of course, the Israeli propaganda machine went into overdrive, saying that these individuals had been given some kind of secret ingredient
Yeah.
to make them look healthy. Well, what they had been given was nutrition and proper care, and that's why they appeared healthy, and that's why the Israeli medics who have treated them and or evaluated them in hospital said that, as with those before them, they were in reasonably good health. Then you have these three who were released this past weekend, and they seemed emaciated, hungry, gaunt, had lost weight, and so on. It's unclear why that's the case. Were they held in different locations where it was much more difficult to provide them with their minimum, with their basic needs? Were they held by a different group that had much less access to food and water and medication and so on? But the broader point I wanted to make is that Palestinians do have obligations under international law and under the rules of war, and that it's important for Palestinians, even in the midst of a Israeli genocidal military campaign against them, it's important for Palestinians to take those obligations seriously. Whether or not there are mitigating circumstances is a different matter. But I also wanted to make the point that any Israeli criticism of a Palestinian failure to meet their obligations should not be taken seriously, and in fact can be contemptuously dismissed with a wave of the hand. Because, you look at the conditions of the of the Palestinian prisoners and hostages who were being released by Israel. I think in this last group, seven had to be immediately hospitalized. And, basically, the Israeli message is full accountability for Palestinians, unconditional impunity for Israel. And that was kind of the basic point. There's also a broader point. One can make all kinds of criticisms of international law and international institutions, and certainly, as any Palestinian can tell you, international law and international institutions on the whole have a rather sordid history when it comes to protecting and promoting Palestinian rights and interests. But the fact of the matter is that the reason we're talking about these principles, about these norms, about these values in 2025 is not because of Israel and its Western sponsors. It's because of the Palestinians. Israel and its Western sponsors, given the changing global environment in recent decades, are engaged in a concerted, systematic campaign to shred these laws, to shred these institutions, to make them irrelevant. And in that context, I think it's important for Palestinians to seek to maintain them, because ultimately, yes, of course, Palestine is not going to be liberated by international law or international institutions, but they can and do play an important political role. I mean, look at the genocide case at the International Court of Justice. That has really ripped the mask off Israel for many people who, out of insufficient familiarity with the question of Palestine, had tended to view Israel as a justified, legitimate reparations for the German Holocaust. Look at the ICC indictments of Netanyahu and Galant. I mean, for Al Karim Khan's foot dragging and so on, which we've discussed previously, it has transformed the Israeli prime minister into an international fugitive. Is he going to go to jail? Of course not. But international law and international institutions can play an important contributing role in what is ultimately a political struggle. And if you want them to be able to play that role, well, you don't act like Israel and only take the other's obligations seriously, while trying to shred the laws and institutions that aren't to your liking. But you begin by taking your own obligation seriously, and at the very least, acknowledging your failures to do so when that is the case. And if I can make one point, I mean, I spoke yesterday to a friend whose nephew was released in this latest group of Palestinian prisoners and hostages that were released by Israel. He had been in prison for some 20 or 21 years out of, I think, a 25 or 26-year sentence. Came out completely emaciated, is apparently unable to hold a meal down because he hasn't had proper nutrition for so long, has lost very considerable proportion of his body weight, has very serious scabies and so on. And what he has been saying since he got out, that of the 20 odd years he's been in prison, the past year has been far and away the most difficult, because after October 7th, um, Israel basically instituted Gestapo tactics against those in its prison system. And not only that, he also said that it was particularly the past 3 days when he and the other Palestinians scheduled for freedom were transferred to Ofer military prison in Betunia, just outside Ramallah. He said those past 3 years were the very worst of the more than 2 decades that he was in Israel's prison system. It was round the clock beatings, abuse, humiliation, deprivation of essentials, and so on. Now, this is very different, of course, than what we already know about the treatment of Israeli captives and hostages in the Gaza Strip, at least so far. One, as I point out, one can point to this disparity. One should point to this disparity. And of course, there's no equivalence. But even if that's true, that doesn't mean that Palestinians do not have obligations, do not have to fulfill their obligations, and somehow should not even acknowledge failure to meet obligations. So, for example, we can have a discussion about whether adult Israelis who are not serving in the military, but are military reservists, are legitimate or illegitimate captives. We can have a moral and political discussion about that. But from a legal perspective, it's black and white. They are considered civilians and therefore hostages who should never have been held captive in the first place. It applies, of course, even more to minors and children. Um, so yes, we need to have these discussions, and one either accepts that these norms and values and laws and institutions are important for whatever reason, but you can only do that if you say they apply equally without distinction to everybody. Or if you want to make the agreement that, these are enemies, these only work against us, they're irrelevant, and we should ignore them. Well, that cuts both ways too. Then stop pushing for the ICJ and the ICC and the General Assembly and so on to fulfill their role and obligations towards the rights and interests of the Palestinian people. That was kind of the broader point I was trying to address. If I could just make one more point, because this is something I didn't address in that thread. I think the role of the Western mainstream media has been absolutely appalling. I mean, you look, for example, this past Saturday, they would have profiles of, there were, I believe, 3 Israeli captives who were released.
Mhm.
We learned all their names. We learned the names of every one of their relatives to the nth degree. We learned about their pasts. We learned about their present. We learned about their future and the past, present, and future of those of their nearest and dearest. Whereas Palestinians, on the whole, remain faceless prisoners who were, detained for good reason and probably shouldn't even have been let out, but are now being given a somewhat longer leash only in order for these, pure and innocent Israelis to once again see the light of day. Absolutely appalling stuff.
I think we'll return to the coverage of the media later on. But I think that was the point you made in your thread about if you are appealing to international law, then you have to abide by international law. And Palestinians, of course, their cause is just legally and morally in every sense. And therefore, I think the onus is on them, as you mentioned in your tweet. And we can also see how the Israelis are the ones, and the Americans under Trump, more so than ever, are the ones who are trying to bulldoze the whole international legal structure because it doesn't serve their interest. And therefore,
Exactly.
they want to seek to change the rules of the game. And changing the rules of the game means torpedoing, destroying, dismantling the ICC, the delegitimizing the ICJ and the UN and whatnot. They're the ones who are trying to completely dismantle the entire structure. The law is on the side of the Palestinians, and therefore they appeal to it more than the Israelis, and therefore the onus is on them to demonstrate that they are abiding by the Geneva Convention. So that is a really important point that you make, and we should stress that. And in terms of the mitigated circumstances, I mean, there's a report in the Israeli sources which mentions that following the Nusayrat raid in June 8, where 276 Palestinians were killed to rescue a number of hostages, Hamas was forced to move the hostages from above ground to below ground, which made it very, very difficult for them to provide food in the way they were doing previous to that. And I think Israelis themselves, they are asking, questioning Netanyahu and his policy of bombing Gaza in the manner he was doing, this kind of saturation bombing, that would endanger the lives of the hostages and also make it difficult for Hamas to look after the hostages and the siege that was imposed and the starvation. So that all, of course, as you mentioned, it doesn't justify the treatment, but that all explains why Netanyahu's own policy was making it very, very difficult
Sure.
for Hamas
Yeah, and I
to.
pointed to some of these things. You can
Mm,
make the argument that a military reservist is is not a civilian non-combatant. You can make that argument politically, morally, whatever, but you can't make that argument under international law, which is very black and white. I mean, you can make the argument that it was Israel's genocidal siege that made it difficult for those holding these captives to properly care for them. That's all true. And it's also true that Hamas already on October 8th offered to immediately release all the civilian hostages in exchange for an Israeli commitment not to invade the Gaza Strip. And it's also true that the only reason that these people have been held for this long is because Israel and the United States repeatedly undermined and sabotaged the conclusion of a ceasefire agreement. That's all true. But at the same time, you can't say that international law is not black and white on these things. That
mm,
if it's someone who a civilian, if it's someone who international law classifies as a civilian non-combatant, even if they're from, the state of Satan, it's simply illegal to take them hostage. And when you have taken them hostage, um, there's a requirement to release them immediately and unconditionally. You may not like that international law says that, but you can't pretend it says anything otherwise.
I think it's important to stress that point. Let's turn our attention to two other stories that appeared last week related to October 7 and also Israel's the way Israel has been conducting its military operation in Gaza since. Before I do that, I want to quote a former UK Supreme Judge, Lord Sumption, who served in the
What
UK's
a name.
highest court from 2012 and 2018. And he was interviewed by The Guardian. He said that Israel's policies in Gaza has been grossly disproportionate. And then he said that, there's an argument to say there is genocide taking place in Gaza. So he's a number of many other judges who have come out and said that what Israel's doing in Gaza is tantamount to genocide, or can be as a strong argument to be made that there is genocide. Um, so I wanted to mention that. So if you want
Mm.
to have a look at his statement, you can go and look
Yeah.
at that. And it's part of a book he's publishing on the challenges to democracy. And one of the things he argues there is that one of the challenges that there's been a crackdown on free speech, and he points to the pro-Palestinian activism and the crackdown against them. He cites that as an example of how there's a global threat to democracy. On specifically October 7, Yoav Galant, former Israeli defense minister, he came out and said that Israel did issue an order to the Hannibal Doctrine, it is called, to which targets or kills Israelis if there's a fear that they will be taken as hostages. So the Hannibal Doctrine was issued. That Yoav Galant came out and said that that's quite a, uh, you know, revelation, I would say. And then also a story in Plus 972 magazine, which documented a number of ways in which Israel was violating international law by gassing Palestinians, or using chemical toxics and chemical gas on Palestinians in the Gaza Strip to target Hamas in the tunnels. So that was quite a revelation as well. So I wanted to basically mention those and let you choose whichever one you want to comment
Sure.
on,
Well,
and feel free to do so.
yeah. Well, let's take those in turn. First of all, I'm a little surprised that Yoav Gallant's admission that Israel used the Hannibal Directive on October 7th and presumably also thereafter, that it's getting so much press coverage, because it's been patently obvious for a while. Just for those who may be unfamiliar with it, the Hannibal Directive is an Israeli military principle which says that a dead Israeli is better than an Israeli held captive by Israel's adversaries. And this was initially formulated to deal with Israeli soldiers, to ensure that to basically, once they were in the clutches of Palestinians, to seek to kill them so that they couldn't be held prisoner and then exchanged for the freedom of Palestinian captives in Israel's prison system. But on October 7th, it was expanded to also include Israeli civilians, to ensure that these civilians were not taken to Gaza Strip as hostages. And it's been abundantly clear for well over a year that this happened. Almost immediately after October 7th, these reports began to emerge. And we then had significant reporting, I believe, by Plus 972 magazine and also by Haaretz, which basically provided the goods that Israel had been using the Hannibal Directive, I think much less in any Western media. But, even without the benefit of these investigative reports, it was already clear. And here, I'll give you just one example. Immediately after October 7th, Israel began announcing that upwards of 1,400 Israelis had been killed on that day. And then I think it was a few weeks or a month or two later, it revised that figure downward to approximately 1,200. And when Israeli officials were asked, how they suddenly reduced the numbers of dead by over 200 people, the explanation given was that they had 200 corpses in their possession of people who had been burnt to a crisp, that they assumed these individuals were Israelis, but that DNA testing and other forensic evidence um, uh, led them to conclude that, in fact, these people were Palestinians and not Israelis. Now, um, the Palestinians who launched the offensive into Israel on the 7th of October were armed with light weapons. I think the most powerful weapon they had at their disposal was an RPG anti-tank launcher. And the idea that you have hundreds of bodies burnt to a crisp, well, that could only come from heavy artillery or from air-to-ground missiles fired by helicopters and so on. So even then, it was already abundantly clear that Israel was shooting at anything that moves without any distinction for probably for multiple reasons, but a key one of which was to prevent any Israelis from being held captive in the Gaza Strip. Now that Galant, who, by the way, as you know, was also an international fugitive from justice, has openly confirmed that this was the order given to the Israeli armed forces when he was directly responsible for giving them these orders. Yeah, that's useful information to have, but to treat it as a revelation about something we never knew anything about before strikes me as a bit of a stretch for the reasons I just mentioned. The second story you referred to is a quite interesting one. So, um, uh, as we've discussed previously, Israel has resorted to the extensive use of these 2,000 pound bunker busting bombs, that have brought down entire residential tower, entire buildings, entire city blocks, and so on. And the assumption was that in at least some cases, they were using them to pinpoint underground structures built by Hamas in order to hit their commanders or weapons stores or whatnot. Well, what's so interesting about this article is I think several issues. First of all, one thing we've learned during the past year is that although Israel appears to have had quite precise intelligence regarding Hezbollah and its underground infrastructure in Beirut and other parts of Lebanon, it really had very little intel and probably still has only limited intelligence about Hamas and Islamic Jihad's subterranean network in the Gaza Strip. The main reason probably is, kind of this racist hubris that it didn't think these people were capable of properly challenging it, and it just didn't take the threat seriously. Now, what this article by, I think it's Yuval Abraham, who has done absolutely stellar work for 972 magazine on a number of occasions, and his most recent investigation revealed is that some years ago, while Israel was conducting tests with these 2,000 pound bunker buster bombs, it found that these bombs release large amounts of carbon monoxide as a byproduct. Carbon monoxide will be familiar to our viewers and listeners as kind of the gas that often causes silent death in apartments or homes when you have gas leaks. It's a odorless, tasteless gas that is, for that reason, considered so poisonous. And when Israel discovered this, it decided to begin using these weapons not only for their direct destructive impact on hitting underground structures, but also using them precisely for this, let's say, additional function of releasing deadly carbon monoxide gas in underground structures in order to kill anyone who's there. So, in other words, these are high explosives, but that are being used as a chemical weapon, being deliberately and knowingly used as a chemical weapon in order to gas people to death. And there was a well known incident in 2021 during I can't remember what the Israeli military operation during the Unity Intifada was called, Swords of something or other.
Mm.
And Israel began sending all these messages that it was going to invade the Gaza Strip. And it later emerged that it was seeking to goad Hamas into taking up defensive positions in the tunnel network facing the boundary with Israel. And Israel then bombed all these tunnels, claimed it had killed many hundreds of Hamas cadres. And it later emerged that very few were killed because Hamas didn't take the bait and didn't deploy. But the purpose of these attacks was not to kill those in the tunnels with the explosive powers of these 2,000 bombs, but to asphyxiate them to death with the carbon monoxide produced when these bombs are dropped. Now, what's important about this investigation is that what Yuval Abraham reveals, and it's very well researched and very well sourced, including named sources from the Israeli security establishment, is that Israel had very little information about where these Hamas commanders were located. It sometimes had only general ideas of what areas they were in. And the way it went after them was to use to drop massive amounts of these 2,000-pound bombs, bringing down entire city blocks, killing dozens of civilian residents for the purpose of unleashing a carbon monoxide poisoning cloud underground in order to kill everyone who was there. So in other words, they were wiping out entire blocks with the hope, not the certainty, but the hope of killing one commander. And in two cases, we had the commander of, I believe, the Hamas Beach Camp Brigade and the Hamas Beit Hanun Brigade, who Israel had announced over the course of the past year that it had killed, using this gas weapon, who turned out to be still alive. And the irony of ironies, of course, is that a number of Israeli captives were gassed to death as a result of the deliberate use of the gas properties of these bombs to kill people. So Israel and its apologists, while spending the last 16 months constantly comparing Palestinian attacks to the Holocaust, constantly comparing each and every Palestinian to Nazis. Well, guess what? You know, the only time that Jews have been gassed to death since 1945 was at the hands of Israel.
I mean, which is shocking to hear. And when I read the article, I mean, if you want to carry out a war of annihilation, that's exactly how you would do it. And
Yes.
that is what really struck me more than anything else about the article. And now we are discussing the aftermath of the war of annihilation, which takes us to the statements by Trump. What do we do now? And he came out with some outrageous statements. And one thing about Trump, which I noticed, is that he comes up with all these crazy proclamations and announcements, and his followers, which is basically a cabal now, they give intellectual coherence to this idea. So even if it's ethnic cleansing in Gaza, many of his followers, I think the overwhelming majority, especially on Twitter and elsewhere, they will give some kind of intellectual coherence and to the crazy idea he comes up with. And this morning he said that, well, last week he said that we'll take over Gaza, and he's committed to buying Gaza and owning Gaza. What does that mean? We don't really know. And this morning he
Does he know?
gave, does he know? It's true. And this morning he said, I think he was pressed on it on this during by a journalist, and he said that no, Palestinians will not be allowed to return to Gaza, in his mad vision for the area. So I'm sure you've been reflecting on this. So what are your main thoughts on this matter? Now, I have a couple of thoughts I'll share, but I just want to ask you first of all, what are your key thoughts since Trump announced this crazy idea of creating Mar-a-Lago on Gaza?
I think they're calling it Gaza Alago or something like that. Look, I
Gaza.
have to start by repeating what I've said previously, which is that Trump is so erratic, so unpredictable, so wacko that trying to um, uh, understand his Middle East policy is a little bit like trying to do a coherent political analysis of yogurt. The guy's just all over the place, and it's impossible to figure out what's going on here. He tends to repeat, the position of the last person he's spoken to, and so on. Um, I would just make, this is obviously, pie in the sky. I would just make several observations. Um, you can't put just the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians on the policy agenda. If you're putting mass forcible expulsion on the policy agenda, then that applies to everyone. It applies to Palestinians, it applies to Israelis, it applies to Arabs, it applies to Americans. Okay, so if it's now a legitimate policy debate in Tel Aviv and Washington to kind of cavalierly talk about permanently expelling 2 million Palestinians from their homeland, well, then it is equally legitimate to have serious discussions in Jerusalem, in Damascus, in Cairo, in Riyadh about getting rid of several million Israeli Jews from Israel and sending them to Mar-a-Lago or whatever. I mean, that's where we've come now. Um, uh, it is now open season on civilian populations. That would be my first observation. My second is that you read the Israeli press and they find this to be very politically useful. Those on the radical right, of course, are in ecstasy, but anyone with a brain understands this isn't going to happen. That it's that it's basically a propaganda tool. But my third observation would be that while the position of Palestinians here is absolutely central, you can't expel people you haven't defeated militarily. And you certainly can't do that when they're already voting with their feet by the hundreds of thousands of returning to northern Gaza rather than heading to the Egyptian border. The absolute key factor here, I think, is the Arab states. So today, you have the Egyptian foreign minister in Washington. Later this week, King Abdullah of Jordan will be there. Now you have, the Saudis up in arms because Netanyahu has suggested that a Palestinian homeland should be established in Saudi Arabia, and they have they've already demonstrated that they have the power to stop this proposal dead in its tracks. I think the only question is, will they use their leverage to continue to do so and to force Trump to back off and choose a different course? If they do, I think that it also demonstrates another thing, that since October of 2023, they could have just as easily used their power and influence to compel Washington to force Israel to stop its genocidal military campaign, but for a number of reasons chose not to do so. An entirely shameful episode of Arab history, But now that Trump Trump's proposal directly impacts them rather than only several million Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip. Well, maybe now they'll grow a backbone.
So I think I will get back to your point about the response of the neighboring countries. I want to turn to the first point you made about if ethnic cleansing is on the table, then it should be for everybody or displacement of the population. And I think one criteria you can use is whoever buys into the idea that Palestine is for Palestinians and Israel is for the Israelis. If you can buy into the two-state solution, then let's keep you there. And if you cannot buy into this solution, then why not displace them? And I think by that criterion, 80% of Israelis would fail that to meet that criterion, because 80% of Israelis strongly support Trump's plan to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from Gaza. That's the latest poll that's out there. So, I mean, yeah, that would be one way of sifting out the extremists from the non-extremist. And
Well, yes. I mean, let me just say that, just to be clear, I'm not advocating
of course, we none of us are, but
forcible
yeah,
expulsion of
yeah.
anyone. I don't consider the forced removal of illegal settlers from illegal settlements and illegally occupied territory to be mass expulsion. They, to the last one, need to be removed from the occupied territory. But I think in terms of, saying that Israeli Jewish citizens need to be forced out en masse. No, of course I'm not advocating that. But what I am saying is, well, what's good for the goose is at least as good for the gander. Don't sit here and have a discussion about the mass forcible expulsion of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip while also denouncing, then you also have to accept that your own expulsion is going to be a legitimate topic of discussion as well. And you can't scream anti-Semitism, Holocaust, and Third Reich when those discussions take place as a direct consequence of the discussion that you insist on having.
Yeah, and another thing that's quite evident from this report is how, from this row is how the Israeli flunkies have gone from um, saying that there is no war of annihilation in Gaza, without battling an eyelid, now saying that, ethnic cleansing is the only solution on the table. And those who oppose ethnic cleansing are somehow morally inferior. So the
Mm.
table's turned on those who are opposed to ethnic cleansing as opposed to those who are carrying it out. That's quite a
Mm.
remarkable thing that's just happened over the past week. And
Yes.
and and the other thing is, um, supporters of the plan say that, oh, Trump's thinking outside the box. I know we've tried
Is he
everything.
ever?
We've tried everything, and then the question that I want to ask, no, we haven't tried everything, um, and the first thing we haven't tried is ending the occupation, and
No.
and no one seems to be asking that question. We haven't tried even the bare minimum, which is to say, occupation is illegal, end the occupation, and then maybe there will be some form of peace in Palestine. So I just find the whole debate really completely out of sync with the reality on the ground. It just seems to be pie in the
Yeah.
sky.
Mm.
And and as I mentioned earlier, his supporters are the one who are the uh, putting the flesh and the meat and some kind of intellectual coherence to his plan to ethnically cleanse Gaza. And I found this whole debate extremely
Yeah.
remarkable that they could
Yeah.
move from one position to another position so quickly without even blinking an eye.
Yeah, and
Um,
and I mean, if I could just make 2 points, you have kind of a cohort of people like, you know, genuine professional charlatans like John Spencer, Andrew Fox, I believe his name is, and a few others who've really made a career since October of 2023 trying to promote this idea that never before in history, has any military observed such extraordinary distinction between combatants and civilians. And, it may be that, perhaps one civilian got a scrape on his knee, but that's about it. This kind of professional genocide deniers, let's call them what they are. And it's amazing the rapidity with which these apologists have gone from saying nothing and no one was hit or damaged or injured unless it was absolutely necessary for legitimate military purposes to now saying we need to get rid of everyone because there's nothing left because everything's been destroyed. Which is it? This kind of chameleon like argumentation of whatever suits the moment, they'll make up the excuse. And then not only that, they're presenting this as a favor to the Palestinians rather than fulfillment of one of Israel's most most passionate aspirations of simply getting rid of these people. But the broader element here, I think, is that there's an orchestrated, concerted effort to once again transform the question of Palestine from a fundamentally political question, as you were suggesting, about self-determination, about statehood, about ending occupation, about decolonization, transforming it from that into a fundamentally humanitarian issue that can be resolved with housing, with jobs, with social services. Kind of, going back to the way the question of Palestine was understood and dealt with, certainly in the West, between 1948 and 1967, as a refugee problem that would be resolved by providing these people with their basic social and humanitarian needs rather than any political rights. And that, of course, has changed entirely since 1967. And there's now a concerted, systematic effort to turn the clock back by a few decades. It's, of course, not going to succeed because let's assume, for the sake of argument, that every last Palestinian is expelled not only from the Gaza Strip, but also from the West Bank and from the Galilee and from the Negev and so on. Well, what happened after 1948? Palestinians organized and took up arms from wherever they were expelled to. And not only that, received very much Arab support in doing so. And I've no doubt that that is exactly what would happen if this completely unrealistic and unimplementable plan were to succeed nonetheless.
Mm. And I actually believe that if Palestinians were forcibly displaced into Jordan and Egypt, for example, Trump is literally opening a pathway in the future for not with the war with the Palestinians, but war with Egypt and Jordan.
Yes.
That's what you're effectively doing. So let's see what he does. And how much of that do you think the current crazy plan is really a result of a realization that, if we can't defeat Hamas, which is what they've concluded, we have to somehow now kick out all the Palestinians. It's a realization of the fact that you cannot destroy Hamas, and because of that, we have to now ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. How much?
Well, I think I'm not sure I would quite use the word plan. It's more
Mm,
proposal, maybe even brainwave, harebrained scheme, whatever. But yes, I mean, you could be right, but what you also need to recognize is you can't forcibly expel people unless you first crush them militarily. You know, either Israel has to succeed where it has failed over the course of almost the better part of 2 years, um, or the United States has to succeed where Israel has failed, and that seems off the agenda given the vociferous objections from Trump's own base, or you kind of have to hermetically seal off the Gaza Strip from food, water, medication, electricity, fuel, and all the rest of it, in the hope that you're going to force these people out. And I don't quite see that happening either. It's already been tried, um, but unless you get key Arab capitals like Cairo, like Amman, like Damascus, like Riyadh, to sign on with this and to assist with its implementation, I don't see how it's going to happen. And, yes, these Arab leaders may be very closely tied to Washington and loyal to it and so on, but not to the point of committing political suicide and signing their own death warrants. It's simply not going to happen.
And if you read the Saudi statement, it sounds like that's what they exactly think, that this would be a death warrant for them. And they described the plan as being extreme, and those who are advocating for it are extremist. I think they used the word extreme twice in their statement, and they went on to say that the proponents of the idea have rejected peace, and I think here they're referring to the 2002
Yeah.
Arab Peace Initiative. So when pro-Israelis asked the question, we've tried everything, but we haven't tried the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, where all the Arab countries said we will normalize relations with Israel as long as they allow Palestinian self-determination in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. So that's one thing which the Arabs have offered. You haven't tried. So yeah, that was another. So I guess you could probably say the Abraham Accords is probably dead, and Saudi Arabia is not going to join the so-called Abraham Accords if the offer on the table is ethnic cleansing, and on top of
Mhm.
that, to expect them to come on board seems quite out of the realms of the possibility.
Well, I think Netanyahu's proposal to establish a Palestinian state in Saudi Arabia, even if it was only a polemical thing, basically amounted to a mercy killing of what has been grandiloquently entitled the Abraham Accords. Yeah, you're right. Everything has been tried. Just getting back to a previous part of our discussion, everything has been tried, except the international consensus as mandated by international law and international institutions. And it's not going to self-implement. It will be the outcome of a sustained and successful political struggle.
Mm. But I had a number of other questions to ask regarding Trump. I think we don't really have much time left, so I wanted to end with an important statement Trump made the other day in front of a journalist, where he was asked about Iran. He signed a memorandum calling for maximum pressure on Iran, but at the same time, he poured cold water on the idea of ever going into any kind of military confrontation with Iran. And during that exchange, one of the journalists asked him, Iran is weak now. Why don't you take advantage of that? And then Trump said, no, Iran is not weak. Iran is actually
Mm,
strong. So he's trying to nip the idea of ever striking Iran or any kind of military confrontation with Iran. He's trying to block that right from the outset. So this seems like a clear blow to the Israelis who,
mm.
I don't know, were hoping to have a president like Trump that would take the war to Iran.
Yep, absolutely. And I think, U.S. Iranian relations are absolutely central to the future of the Middle East. What Trump doesn't seem to remember is that during his first term, his policy of open belligerence towards Iran, and particularly his unilateral renunciation of the Iranian nuclear agreement, ensured that Iran refused to negotiate with him, even though Trump repeatedly sought to negotiate with the Iranians, and even at one point during the UN General Assembly, made repeated overtures to meet with the Iranian president at the time, and they would have nothing to do with him because, for very good reason, they considered him completely unreliable, untrustworthy, bad faith actor. The difference now is that it's a very different region than it was during Trump's first term, and I think um, uh, all the elements for a successful engagement between the United States and Iran are there. The problem is that Trump is doing very contradictory things. On the one hand, he is sidelining the Iran hawks like Brian Hook, like John Bolton, like Mike Pompeo, and all the rest of it. But at the same time, is also engaging once again in belligerent, hostile acts towards Iran. This maximum pressure business that not only makes it difficult for Iran to engage with the United States, but increases their determination not to engage with someone they see as an untrustworthy and bad faith actor. And unless Trump gets his act together, um, what he may not realize is that he's in fact creating an opening for Israel to seek to provoke a direct U.S. Iranian military confrontation.
That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani. Thank you, Mouin, for
Thank
joining us
you.
again. As ever, it's fascinating to listen to your analysis of the situation on the ground. And thank you for tuning in, and see you next week for another episode of Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nasim Ahmed. Bye-bye.